Hi, this is Matthew with RetroEdge Tech, and I'd like to talk with you about some of the kind of oddities of the CentOS Linux installer. Most of the time I use other distributions of Linux. Ubuntu has been my go-to for a very long time. I used Ubuntu for well over a decade as my primary operating system. More recently, I've been using some Arch-based stuff. So I'm currently on Manjaro. There's my Manjaro background desktop. And also been experimenting with Alpine Linux, which I've been liking very much. That's more kind of server stuff. I was commissioned actually as part of my work. I usually don't do a lot of Linux stuff as far as customer facing with Linux. I do some. I sell some computers with Linux pre-installed. Some people want me to remove Windows and install Linux, or have a dual boot. Dual boots were more of in the past. Usually people are wanting to run one or the other, or sometimes we'll do a dual boot where one disk will have Windows and one disk will have Linux, and then they can use the BIOS to switch, or setting up a virtual machine with one or the other, having Windows in a virtual machine in Linux, or Linux in a virtual machine in Windows. Some of that type of thing I do as far as like more consumer use cases, or desktop or workstation type uses might be a better term. So I don't do a whole lot necessarily with server stuff yet, though I'm looking to get into more Linux server based stuff. So CentOS has a different installer than most I guess Linux distributions. It doesn't use the Calamares installer that's really popular with a lot of Linux distributions, but it has a kind of a graphical text installer even for their server, a graphical installer, and it's not just a text-based installer like Alpine. It's just text. There's no graphics with the Alpine Linux installer. I guess while I'm talking, I'll bring up the CentOS virtual machine. And I'm going to actually be doing this. I already did the test media and install CentOS thing to kind of preview this. This is a live boot to the install ISO. I guess I'll just do that again. I'll select test this media and install CentOS. And what it's going to do is it's just going to do a checksum on the download to make sure that it's not obviously wrong or messed up. And I think you should see that here on the screen in just a little bit. It takes a little bit of time to check that. And this is the checking part there that it's going through. That's where it's checking to make sure that the checksums are correct, that it's the right size and not corrupted or messed up. That's what it expects. So, and starting the installer, so it's going to be starting up this little graphical interface that's different. And one of the oddities is that it doesn't automatically configure the network. So when it gets into this thing here, okay, we'll click through on the language part. So I'm going to choose English. And this is the part that is really weird. So in most Linux distribution installations with a graphical installer, it'll just use DHCP to automatically grab the network, and it just kind of guides you through the kind of recommended installation steps. Here, there's like all of these exclamation points on the screen, like this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. But the thing to check first that it solves some of these other things. So here in software, the error is error setting up base repository. And here is installation source not set up. That's because it's not getting a network connection, and it gives those errors first. And so over here on the system part, network and host name, I'll click on that. And it just, by default, the installer has the network turned off. This might be for some security reasons or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. But this is kind of a net installer because it needs to pull things down, I believe. I'm not sure about that. This was the smaller of the ISOs, about 600, yeah, 600 megabytes or so. So I believe it's going to have to go out to the internet to grab some of the things that you want to install or the options that you have. But by default, this little switch box is turned off. Ethernet's just off. So the first time I booted into the CentOS installer, that was a pretty confusing part. So figured it out, go to the Ethernet part, click on OK or on, and now it's got an address, and you can see this is through my little virtualized network with GNOME boxes. And then I will click on done. And then after that, then you see that in the software part, it says downloading group metadata, downloading group metadata. Closest mirror, that's all good now. It's selected that now and configured itself now that we've set up the network. We still got 2 exclamation points. It seems that you have to like uncheck it and then check it and then press done. And then the automatic partitioning is selected and that goes away. And of course, if you had a more complicated setup, with multiple disks and all that, this is the part where you might do that. And so maybe it's just alerting you, hey, check to make sure that it's right. But it kind of gives you an error exclamation point at first. Okay, so we've taken care of a lot of them. Software selection. So for me, I'm going to want a server without the graphical user interface. So I'm going to click there, an integrated, easy to use managed server. And then I get to, if I wanted to pre-install some things. Now I know that I'm going to be using the LAMP stack, Linux, Apache. M stands for the database like MySQL, or MariaDB, used to be MySQL, and then P for PHP, or other programming languages like Perl or Python. So the LAMP stack. But I'm going to be, as for one of the jobs that I'm going to be doing, is actually to install a particular application in the LAMP stack. So Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. It actually is a PHP web-based app. It's going to be used in a business or private practice. So I could click on this basic web server here, but it doesn't really tell me what it's installing. It doesn't tell me that it's Apache, though I'm pretty sure that it is. Yeah, it doesn't say if it's going to be loading in MySQL or that sort of thing in the background. I think that I will just leave that checked, just to, say, hey, what does it install? And it's probably going to install the things that I want for this particular setup. And if it installs some other stuff or it's not needed, it either doesn't really matter, or I can easily remove them using the package manager. But then, of course, the server, integrated, easy to manage server, and then here's the server with the graphical user interface. I'm not sure if that, yeah, I think it's installing GNOME on top of it, yeah. Because if I go back to server here, here you have the option of installing GNOME with a desktop environment. I don't want that. I just want the text-based interface login. I don't want a desktop environment. So I'll click on that. I'll click on done. And then finally, it's going to have all of these things be okay. And I will go ahead. I'll do the install. I'm going to set up the things that I want in a virtual machine. And then I'm going to use CloneZilla to make an image of that. So with all the things that I want set up. And then I will actually apply that directly to hardware. I've done that a few times before and I haven't had any problems. It's worked out great. And I often do that to make images with exactly what I want, and I don't necessarily have to dedicate a particular machine hardware-wise to set that up. Though most of the time when I use CloneZilla to make an image, I use it on particular hardware so that all Usually it's with Windows that I'm doing it, so that the drivers for that hardware are installed with Windows and the setup for that hardware is set up in Windows, and then I make an image of that. But in this case, I'm going to be using a virtual machine, setting up the LAMP application, the web-based application setup, server setup. And then once I've got it, yeah, hey, this basic configuration is working, then I'm going to make a clone sample image of it and then apply that image onto the hardware that I'm going to be using and then deploying in the small business. I think that'll work great. If any of my viewers have encountered problems with that, if you know of an issue with doing it that way, please let me know. But in my experience, it's worked great and I have no problems with hardware compatibility or anything like that, starting out on a virtual machine and then migrating that install with a custom setup to on metal hardware. So that's my plan. I'm going to start the process here of installing, but I wanted to show you that little gotcha, that kind of weird thing with the CentOS installer with having to set the network first. That by default the installer has the network off, and that you have to check the on Ethernet thing, which it's not usual in most Linux distributions. The reason I'm choosing CentOS is kind of part of the Red Hat family of Linux distributions. And for this customer, having something that's based on something that they're familiar with, they've heard of Red Hat Linux, they like that kind of thing, and they say, yes, I'd like my web application on kind of Red Hat. And CentOS is essentially the open source, non-branded Red Hat Enterprise Linux. CentOS is almost identical to Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So that way, if that customer that I'm setting this up for needs help with their Linux installation later, but I'm not available, they could hire any Red Hat Enterprise Linux certified person, a sysadmin type of person, to come help them out. So that's one of the reasons to choose something like CentOS. Often larger companies will choose CentOS. They'll say, yes, we want the option of getting paid support or having certified administrators working on it, but we don't necessarily need to pay for the Red Hat Enterprise Linux. I don't know if they call it a license, but essentially you're paying for support for your Red Hat Enterprise Linux installations. And if you have a lot of servers, that can be pretty expensive. So a lot of companies, especially smaller ones, will choose CentOS instead. And then if they have issues or problems or need support, they can hire that, because CentOS is pretty much the same as Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So it's an option, but they don't have to, which I believe is the primary difference between CentOS and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That's about all I wanted to talk about today, is just this odd thing with the CentOS install with the network being turned off by default. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.